Hi, everyone. I'm Congresswoman Katie Porter. Thank you so much for joining me today to have a discussion about policing and racial justice in our community. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to be with you all so we can talk about how to make our community more inclusive and safe for Black Americans. Our country promises equality and justice for all citizens, but I know that for Black and Brown Americans in particular, this has for too long been an unfulfilled promise. It is so important that we continue to demand change until people of color are treated equally and fairly. We all have a role to play in shaping our democracy, and our democracy isn't working until it's working for everyone. For far too long, our systemic racism in our country's policing, law enforcement, and criminal justice system has disproportionately threatened the lives of Black Americans. The murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd at the hands of police officers are only the tip of the iceberg. Black and Brown Americans have been the targets of unnecessary racial violence for our country's entire history. This continued brutality is unacceptable and it must end. No American should tolerate the continued failure of police officers to keep people safe in their custody, at home, or in their neighborhoods. And as your representative, please know that I will be a vocal ally against hate and racism wherever it appears in our community and in the country. I also want to recognize that we are in the midst of one of the greatest global economic and health challenges we've ever faced, one that has disproportionately hurt communities of color. It's clear that we need to address societal inequities beyond policing that place people of color at a disadvantage. I am committed to addressing the glaring disparities in our communities so that we can heal and move forward. I am happy to answer any questions that you have today about the policies I'm working on in this space, from healthcare to policing and everything in between. A few weeks ago, the House of Representatives passed the Justice in Policing Act, the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. This is the first ever bold, comprehensive approach to hold police accountable, end racial profiling, change the culture of law enforcement, empower our communities, and build trust between law enforcement and our communities by addressing systemic racism and bias to help save lives. This legislation happened only because our communities spoke up, and we're here today to continue the conversation. Thank you all for your engagement and for your advocacy on racial justice issues. I know that we all want to build a safer, more fair world for our children. I'm in this fight with you, and I want you to know that I and my office are always here to help you. I'm looking forward to learning from you all today and hoping that we can have a productive discussion with my former colleague and friend, Dean Song Richardson. I have to tell you, I'm so excited to introduce you, Song. Song is the Dean and Chancellor's Professor of Law at the University of California, Irvine School of Law. She has joint appointments in the Department of Criminology, Law and Society, and in the Department of Asian American Studies. She is also formerly my boss, which was a very hard job, and she was very, very good at it. Song is a leading expert on implicit racial and gender bias in a variety of contexts, including emerging technologies. She's frequently invited to speak in front of judges and law firms, district attorneys and public defenders' offices, police departments, universities, bar associations, and private industry across the world about the science of implicit bias and its influence on decisions, perceptions, and judgments. She has consulted with public and private entities seeking to develop best practices to improve racial and gender disparities within their organizations. And she is also a leading expert on race and policing, including numerous articles on police violence. So I'm really thrilled to welcome Song here tonight. We're so lucky to have you join us, and I'm really excited to begin the conversation. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Congressman Porter. I cannot tell you how thrilled and honored I am to have this conversation with you, especially because of all the incredible and impactful work you are doing. I wish more Congresspeople were like you. You are incredible.
I really appreciate it. I always say that my law students really taught me how to question people.
Oh.
Some of them, as you know, are well prepared, and some of them are not as well prepared. And that's true about witnesses as well as students in the classroom. So
well, you embody what it means.
Yeah, exactly. I wanted to start by asking you a little bit about the work that you're doing at UC Irvine Law School.
Sure.
UC Irvine is right in the heart of the 45th Congressional District, and the law school was founded, I guess it's been over 10 years ago now.
Yeah.
We just had our 10th anniversary. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on at UCI Law and how it relates to the events that we're witnessing nationally?
Absolutely, it would be my pleasure. So UCI Law, as you know, since you were a member of our faculty, was started a little over 10 years ago to do things differently. And from the very beginning, we believed in diversity, in inclusive excellence, in fighting the cause of social justice. That were our founding values. And we continue to do those things now. And part of what has been both heartening and frustrating for me, just generally for a moment, with the movement going on across the country, I'm thrilled that more and more people are spending time on these important issues of anti-Blackness and racism. But I hope it's not just platitudes, right? I hope it leads to true action like the work that you are doing. So what we have been doing at the law school in this space, in the anti-Blackness, racism space, has predated the important events that are occurring right now. Many of our faculty, almost all of our faculty, our research faculty, have been doing work in this space, in racism read broadly. We have mandatory clinics where our students are representing people out in the communities on issues related to anti-Blackness and racism. We are one of the most diverse law schools in the country when it comes to our faculty and when it comes to our student body. And that's because law truly is at the center of so many of the problems that we're seeing today. And so if a law school does not take these issues seriously, does not teach them in the classroom as we do, and doesn't train our students to understand our nation's history of structural racism and how to fight it, then law schools aren't doing their job. And those are the things that we have always done, that we are committed to doing. And especially because for me personally, this is an issue that I've been working on my entire career. So you'll be thrilled to know, Congresswoman, that we continue in the fight against all of these issues.
Well, and I want to ask you a little more about your specific research around injustice in criminal courts and around policing. But I think the point where you're starting is really an important one, which is there's a lot of racism in virtually every system of law or society or policy that people touch. You and I actually did a panel several years ago about racism in bankruptcy. And that sounds like a race neutral topic. We think, well, what does that have to do with race? And it turns out a lot. So some of my own research was looking at the fact that Black people disproportionately seek the form of bankruptcy relief that costs more, that it was less likely to relieve them from their debts, that really puts them in kind of a debt servitude situation. And we couldn't find any other explanation for why this would be. We held equal lots of the disparities that exist between Black and white people, like wealth, like income, like age, all of those things. So the resulting assumption is that there might be implicit bias at stake. So I wondered if you could just start by talking about some other examples in the law with the things that my colleagues are doing, our colleagues are doing at the law school, some other areas where people are studying racism in the justice system.
So I think the way that I'll start answering that question is to say that every single one of our faculty are now having discussions about including discussion of racism and anti-Blackness in every single subject. Because truly, when you think about the centuries of structural, systemic, and explicit racism that has existed, right, since our country, since our nation began, I should say, right, race has played a central part. So often when we think about race, in my own research, I think about criminal law and policing. That seems an obvious place. But as you mentioned, bankruptcy, tax law, civil procedure, con law is an obvious place, tort law. There's a recent article that just came out in the past week or so that talks about the impact of race on torts, right? On personal injury type cases.
So I think some of that research suggests, for example, that juries are less likely to make pain and suffering awards to Black Americans who are injured than they are to white Americans with similar injuries.
Isn't that amazing? But it's unsurprising. So it's unsurprising that when you lift up the rock and you look underneath, every single aspect of the law has a racial component, whether it's tax law on the one hand, tort law, like you just discussed. And to add a study to that, they had these studies where they would take a needle and stick it in someone's hand, right? Fictional, obviously, a dark hand and a white hand. And what they found is there's a part of our brain that feels empathy. And when a white individual sees a needle going through a white hand, that pain center lights up. When they see it going through a dark hand, nothing happens, right? This is how deeply ingrained racism and race is in our nation, so much so that it gets embedded in our minds when we don't even know that it exists. So every single area of the law is impacted by the centuries of structural racism that exists in our country as a legacy of slavery.
And of course, we're seeing that right now with healthcare outcomes, and people are saying, well, Black and brown communities are being disproportionately harmed by coronavirus, but that would be equally true if you were to look at a whole range of health issues, right? Diabetes, the need for transplants, pollution and sort of environmental justice issues, asthma. There's a number of health disparities that exist. So this isn't new from coronavirus. We're shining a light on it in this moment with coronavirus, but some of those issues are, as you said, it would actually be surprising to not find racial disparity in these systems. And I think that's an important starting point for us. So I remember when I wrote my consumer law textbook, I have a chapter, I think it's the second chapter, and it's called Who is a Consumer? And one of the things I talk about in it is the way that in so many laws, the kind of assumption we make about a consumer actually maps onto kind of the economic, educational, lifestyle, all of these different things, profiles of a white family, right? So true. And then it affects how we think about things like what would a reasonable consumer do? Right. And then that trickles into the law. So tell me, I want to talk a little bit about the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act specifically. Sure. And as you know, it would do a number of different things, but to remind everyone, it would establish a national standard for the operation of police departments. It would reprogram existing funds to invest in transformative community-based policing programs. It would streamline federal law to prosecute excessive force and establish independent prosecutors for police investigations. How would those kinds of reforms, and the bill does more things, but I want to start there. How would those kinds of reforms help make our communities safer?
So I'm so thrilled to hear about this and the fact that it has that you pushed this. Right? Because how will it make our community safer? I'll start from the last thing that you mentioned, which is having independent prosecutors prosecute police misconduct. The reason that is so critically important is typically prosecutors work very closely with police officers. In fact, if you're a prosecutor, and I often tell my students this, if you're a prosecutor and you decide that you don't believe a particular police officer, so you won't call him to testify on the witness stand, you will be punished by the other police officers. They won't testify in your cases anymore, right? They'll tell all the other police officers about it. So it's so critically important to have someone independent come in who doesn't have that pressure to prosecute the bad officer. And even police who won't say it publicly want the bad officers to be prosecuted. It sends a message to the rest of the officers, and that taking bad officers off the street, because there are a small percentage of those officers that do most of the misconduct, and yet they keep their jobs, they get transferred from one department to another department. So being able to prosecute them effectively is critically important, but it's not enough to stop there, right? Because you have to look at the entire system of policing and the incentives it gives for bad policing to happen. And by bad policing, I'm not talking simply about uses of force. I'm talking about stops and frisks and all the other practices that we could talk about later. But the other thing I love about the bill is it is placing resources where they are most needed, in the communities. That is how we make communities safer, by investing in our communities, in housing, in education, in after-school programs, in reentry programs, right? It struck me the other day, I'm a member of this commission looking at the penal code, and we had formerly incarcerated individuals speak to us. And what they said was, while they were serving time in prison, they were given programs that they never had access to when they weren't in prison. How ridiculous is that?
Well, we've all heard stories about people who reoffend in order to go back to prison to be able to get medical care, for example.
Exactly. Exactly. So your bill does so many important things to punish the bad officers, which is critically important, and to bring the resources back to the community where they can make the most difference. That's how we.
No, I think that's really helpful. Can you talk a little bit about the history of racism in policing? What does it mean for communities of color to have that history? How does it shape sort of how we got to this moment and how we figure out how to move forward?
Oh, that is such a deep and great question. I'm sure most people know that the history of policing in the South came out of slave patrols. Right? That's how police started in the South. So is it any surprise that that thread of racism continues to the present day? I don't think so, right? History is meaningful. And then when you add to that, the way that our criminal justice system has been placed on the backs of Black people. That's it, right? That is what our criminal justice system does. In order to make people feel safe, police have focused their energies on communities of color. And it doesn't have to be indigent communities of color, right? On communities of color. And when you speak to police, as I do often, they are also, especially former police, they are trained to pay attention to race. Being Black means you are suspicious. And so the amount of over-policing that happens in our communities, the over-policing that doesn't focus on the violent crimes, but that focus on the non-violent, petty crimes. I mean, think about pot, for instance. It's legalized, right? And yet we still see, and we know that white people use pot to the same extent as Black people do. And yet, when you look at who gets arrested for possession of pot, we still see these racial disparities exist. So is it any surprise then that we are over-policed when it comes to non-violent petty crimes, under-policed when it comes to violent crimes, that communities don't trust the police? Why would you ever call the police, ask them for help, when everything you have heard your entire life and experienced yourself has been negative policing for the most part? There are some few exceptions, but for the most part, policing has taken place on the backs of Black people. And so it should not be a surprise then that to the present day, we do not trust the police. And
I think that point you made about under-policing and over-policing is a really important one, because I think that is a really important point, because you see people who, because of this involvement of these low-level offenses or the high level of suspicion, then they hesitate to call the police when they really do need help. And that affects things like child abuse reporting. It affects things like calls for domestic disturbances. It affects things like, when people have their house broken into, if people would call the police in a white community and in a Black community, they might say, I don't want to get involved in this. And so it leads to actually both an under-enforcement and an over-enforcement problem. And really that makes us all less safe. And I think that's one thing about this movement that's really important to think about is, we all benefit from safer communities. And that's really what the goal is here. And we're not going to have safer communities if we have this racial bias driving our policing system. In order to have a safe community, we want to allocate the resources where they're needed, and where the problems are, free of that racial lens. Now, Song, I hate to do this to you, but I should say Dean Richardson.
No,
you can call me Katie. I wanted to ask you about this. I don't know if we talked about this in advance with you, but you're such an expert on this. I feel comfortable asking you. You know, when we did some of that research on the racial difference in the bankruptcy system, hundreds of bankruptcy lawyers called me and they all said the same thing. I'm not racist, right? So it can't be like, this can't be because I'm not racist.
Right.
So can you talk about how we understand? I think this is a question a lot of parents are grappling with their children too, and talking to them, is how do we explain to ourselves, to our children, the difference between structural racism and kind of personal racism? And how do we explain the difference between explicit bias and implicit bias? Because I think those concepts are really important to untangle, and I think they create space for people to step up and become more vocal allies in fighting for justice for Black Americans.
Those are such great questions. So let me start with the difference between the conscious racist, right? The quintessential bigot versus the person who is implicitly or unconsciously biased. And the ease with which, one way to understand that is, I'll just give you an example of me, right? I'm Black, I'm Korean, I'm a woman. Okay, I took this test that can help us figure out, do we have unconscious bias that can impact us? It's called the implicit association test. And I took it over a decade ago. It's why I started to focus on these issues, because when I took it, what it showed me, a Black woman, is that I had negative attitudes towards Black people, to my own people. I thought white people were more innocent and Black people were guilty, right? I had that. I could talk about the rest of my unconscious biases, but I won't. It's to make the point that living in this society, just living in it, seeing what the news is on TV every night, seeing what the world looks like, even watching the murder of George Floyd, our brains take in all of this information, and it doesn't matter what we consciously believe. What our world teaches us is that to be Black is to be disadvantaged. To be white is to be privileged. And our brains learn that. And that's where our unconscious biases come from. So even I have to be careful when I'm doing things that I am not acting on my unconscious bias, that I am not viewing someone as more suspicious because they happen to be a person of color than someone who is white. Because if I'm not paying attention, it will impact my own actions and decisions. We can all be unconsciously biased, but act in similar ways that a racist would. So it is unconvincing to say, I am not consciously biased, because your unconscious mind takes over. It's like an AI system, and I can talk about that if that's of interest. Okay, so that's the difference between my own conscious egalitarian beliefs and my unconscious biases that can impact my behaviors. To get to the question of how do we separate individual racism from structural racism? So let me talk about that very quickly. When we think about structural racism, what we're essentially saying is, as a legacy of slavery, our institutions, I'll give an example. Let's talk about the educational system. Because even today, if you go into some poor, indigent Black communities, there aren't books for all the students. Some students don't have desks to sit at. Why is that? It's because we have not invested in public schools in certain communities, versus in a similarly situated white community. It is hard to imagine that not everyone has a book, right? That you can't bring a book home to study. That is an example of structural racism. The structures that have come out of slavery have resulted in inequitable situations, like schools. So now you cannot tell a student who has gone and really succeeded against all odds in a school where he couldn't or she couldn't bring a book home, and have that person compete with the individual who, from the time they were in elementary school all the way to when they graduated from high school, had the best teachers, and have those two compete against each other as if they were equal the whole time. So structural racism takes into account the inequities that certain communities have faced for centuries and the benefits that other communities have faced for centuries, often on the backs of the Black community. So we are starting out like this right now, not because of anything we've done, but because of the history of conscious racism that is now embedded in all of our institutions. And that is what we have to address if we really want to address the race problem in our country. And I don't know that people have the stomach for that.
Well, I do, and I think we all should. We all should. And I think one of the things I tell people is that you're not going to address structural racism without changing structures. So
exactly,
as much as we all should be, I mean, I think it's an interesting moment because we all need to be taking individual action. My daughter asked me if she could make a Black Lives Matter sign for our yard. It's very cute. It has like bunny rabbits on it. I don't really know what it has to do with Black Lives, but it's big letters. It says Black Lives Matter. She made it for our yard, and I thought that was great. That's an individual action, but no amount of yard signs is going to address the fact that we do not fund things like hospitals that treat Black people at the same level as we do hospitals that treat white people. So before we got on this event, I was doing an event about healthcare, listening to a really interesting research paper, finding that there are, fewer of basically everything in Black hospitals. The rooms are smaller. The amount of the equipment's older. There's less equipment. And all of these things, the waiting rooms are smaller. And that means you leave quicker, right? There's long lines. And so we have to really be willing to attack some of those structures. And I think that's, when we talk about police reform, I think that's one of the big differences kind of in where the House tried to start. And the House bill, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act it's not going to make everything go away.
Right.
It is an important and powerful step in the right direction. And I think one of the things that's really different about the House bill versus sort of the Senate bill and what we saw from the president was, we really don't need to study a phenomenon that has been going on for hundreds of years. We need to take action on it. That isn't to say we don't still study it.
Right.
But I wondered if you could talk a little bit about some of your own research and share with people. One of the things I remember you and I talking about is sort of efforts to diversify police forces, which was one of the efforts that we thought might help with police brutality. And I think it's safe to say that it's opened up opportunity for Black Americans to serve in good, high-paying law enforcement jobs. But as you pointed out, even Black Americans can police in biased ways against Black people. So I wondered if you could share a little bit of your research about criminal law and criminal justice.
Absolutely. And I'll focus on the policing example because I think it's a perfect example, especially the way that you framed it. It is important to do both. It is important to focus on the individual acts at the same time that you focus on the structures. So, and here's a perfect example. One individual officer, no matter what his race, can do horrible things, can kill someone, can kill a Black citizen, not because they are consciously racist, but because of their own unconscious bias, right? So we need to deal with the individual unconscious biases that can lead to horrific and deadly results. At the same time, however, that's not enough because the way that policing works can cause additional racial disparities. So I'll give an example of quotas. Every police department claims that they don't have quotas for the number of people that they arrest, the number of tickets that they write. But when you speak to individual officers, they say, there is definitely a quota. I have to make a certain number of arrests every day. And where do they do that policing? It's not going to be in the affluent white communities where someone is going to pick up a phone because their child got stopped and questioned by the police. They're going to do it in communities that they feel don't have much political power, right? Indigent communities of color. And so even if I'm a Black officer who's totally egalitarian, wants to fight the fight, if I also want to move up within the police department, I am going to go to those same communities and stop and frisk people to meet my quota, right? So that is an example of you can be consciously egalitarian and still engage in problematic policing practices. So we have to deal with the general criminal justice policies that result in practices like stops and frisks. And I could say the same thing about prosecutors, about probation officers, about judges, about defense lawyers, including public defenders, of which I was one, right? Because race, as you've mentioned at the beginning, impacts every discretionary system and institution in our culture. So we got to do both. We got to diversify departments, diversify institutions, hospitals, schools, and address the institutional or structural things that are in place that lead to racial disparities, even if everyone working there was fair and consciously egalitarian. That's why the two have to work together.
Yeah, and I think, I think it's, when we start to understand and begin to appreciate more and more and more the degree to which there's structural racism embedded in so many systems, I think there can be a temptation to say, well, it's so hard. What can I do? And I think it's the opposite impulse that I urge people to feel, which is these hard fights are the ones worth having. These deep historical problems are the ones worth changing, right? And that's really, and it's not going to be quick and it's not going to be easy, but we can make progress. And it really is possible. And I'll just give one example. I mean, this is the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And that law and robust enforcement of that law really did help reduce discrimination against people with disabilities. It doesn't mean that those with disabilities don't face discrimination still today, including structural discrimination. They do. There's a huge fraction of polling places today that still aren't handicap accessible, for example, for those with physical disabilities. But we made a lot of progress. And so we're at a moment where we're saying, what more can we do? And that's what we should be trying to do with the Justice and Policing Act. Pass this, make these changes, and then keep asking ourselves, what more do we need to do? What more can we do? I wanted to talk a little bit about, the Justice and Policing Act has all these community-based programs and to sort of help people, as you said, sort of solve that over-enforcement and under-enforcement problem, but really invest in communities. One of the things I've been working on a lot of legislation about is to support people who are dealing with mental illness or who need mental health care. When and if those folks come in contact with the police, there are often harms. Do you have any thoughts on what that intersection's like in communities of color in particular?
So what an incredibly important piece of the act, because when you think about our jails and our prisons, I would venture to say, maybe it's not the majority, but it is a significant portion of people who are in our jails and prisons who are there because of a mental illness, because we have not invested in mental health. Outside in our communities, we have decided that it's so much easier, right, to just arrest people and throw them in custody where they will not get the actual care that they need. And I think that we have asked our law enforcement officers to do too much. We rely on them to do everything. We want them to be law enforcement. We want them to be law enforcers. We want them to be social workers. We want them to be mental health workers. No one individual can do all of that. And so being cognizant of the fact that mental health care is such an incredibly important part of keeping our people safe, our community safe, helping people get the care that they need and not be killed by the police who don't actually know how to address mental illness. You can get all the training you need, right? All the training you want, right? It is important to train our police, but they're not the experts. They don't spend their careers learning about and understanding how to interact with people who are going through a mental health crisis. So why not let the experts do that? We can reduce our prison and jail populations. We can avoid deaths that should not happen, and we can avoid traumatizing people who are already traumatized in our communities. So that is one of the most important and impactful parts of the bill, is the focus on mental illness and how to actually give people the treatment that they deserve in this country, and not just warehouse them in jail where everything about their mental health deteriorates.
So I'm introducing legislation that would create special mental health first responder units. So the person responding to a call about a person who's likely having a mental health crisis is someone who's a trained mental health professional. You think about a doctor in an ER, even with years of training, ER doctors will tell you it's very hard for them to give any meaningful diagnosis in a short time in an ER setting. That's in a healthcare setting.
Right.
But for the police to being asked to do it on the streets, I think is really, really challenging. And I think one of the things about 911, the idea of having a centralized number that you call, every kid knows that number. If your kids, puts a piece of toast in, the toaster catches on fire, children know 911. But it also means that all different kinds of calls are coming into the same hub.
Yes.
And very frequently, the police are being deployed rather than other kinds of providers that might make more sense. And so I think that is one of the I think it's an unintended consequence of 911 is we need different kinds of units because the breadth of calls that come into 911 are so very, very broad. So I think that's really important. Idea. So I think that's something I've been thinking about, the 911, but it's everybody calls it for every kind of problem, right? And so I think that's a challenge. I wanted to ask you here about what kinds of other kinds of policing reforms. We've talked a lot about qualified immunity. That's something that's in the House bill. You were a defense attorney. You were on the system. Tell me why you think, help people know what that is. I think there's a lot of misinformation circulating around about qualified immunity and what ending it would mean. Can you explain the concept of immunity and why what this really does is put the law back to where it was and where it exists in other areas and what's special about the current system and why we need to change it?
Yes, absolutely. So the easiest way, I think, to think about qualified immunity is to think of someone who has broken the law, who has done something wrong, committed a murder. Let's bring it right to the George Floyd situation. Because of qualified immunity, because police are part of the government, the laws on qualified immunity make it incredibly difficult to prosecute civilly or criminally a police officer. So I'm going to give you one example. This is the use of chokeholds. That we know the LAPD would use chokeholds, and it would result in, they would often use them, as you know, in a racially disparate way, and Black people died. So the thought was, why don't we sue the LAPD and eliminate chokeholds? Because of qualified immunity, we could not bring that lawsuit, because what the law required in order to sue is to prove that another officer would target another individual Black man and use a chokehold on him. And if we could prove that, then we could bring the suit. But how do you prove that when it hasn't yet happened? And so this immunity that protects bad actors from being prosecuted in court is a huge problem. And if we could get over the hurdle of qualified immunity, we could bring more justice to people who are being treated in unjust and dangerous and criminal ways by police. So that would make, that is an example of a structural remedy that would have such an enormous impact on being able to prosecute police officers and police departments.
Yeah, no, I think it's really important. And I think people need to understand that there are a lot of people who work in law enforcement who actually are frustrated that there are not consequences
Right.
for those who break the rules, for those who violate the norms, those who engage in misconduct, because it really ultimately makes those other officers less safe,
Exactly.
because it escalates situations. And so I think that's just a really important closing point here, is that the goal of Black Lives Matter, the goal of justice and policing, and increasing the level of justice, is to improve safety for all Americans. And it's, that is really, when we talk about democracy, if it's not working for some of us, it's not working for all of us. That's because it's a collective system. And so is policing. So is public safety. It's like public health. It's not just about what you do, it's about what those around you do. It's not just about your experience with the police, it's about the experience of other people in the community with police.
Yes.
I wanted to close by asking you to get your thoughts about, I want to talk about intersectionality. And so a few weeks ago in the Committee on Oversight and Reform, where I serve, I had the opportunity to ask Professor Kimberly Crenshaw about intersectionality. And for those who weren't able to join Professor Crenshaw and see that discussion, she explained that intersectionality is a framework for understanding how aspects of a person's social and political identities might combine to create different kinds of discrimination and privilege. So you're a great example of this song. You already gave the example. You said, I'm a Black American. I'm an Asian American.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a woman. All of these things, and including, I would add, you're highly educated, right? You live in a suburban community. Like, these are all things that combine to shape how you think about power, how you think about who has it and who doesn't. How can we bring kind of this intersectional lens? Because I think it's important to recognize that the experience for Black men is different than it is for Black women. Right. And I think there are, we talk about overpolicing and underpolicing. I think there's a lot of research that suggests sometimes Black women don't receive the justice that they need. They don't receive the level of protection from the police that they deserve, where in some cases Black men are being overpoliced. And that's not to say that there aren't instances going the other direction.
Right.
But how can we bring an intersectional lens to the work that we're doing? And how can we use that concept to help become more personally comfortable in these conversations?
Oh, that's a great question. So with the first, how can we do it? My answer is just do it. And right, and what does that mean, really? So we can never live in someone else's shoes. We can be empathetic. We can try to put ourselves in other people's shoes to try to think about all the ways in which lives are impacted differently. But to me, one of the most important pieces is diversity, equity, and inclusion. Because if you have a diverse group of people, different gender identities, different races, right, different, in every way that you can think of, ethnicities, you don't have to worry as much that you won't be thinking about things outside your experience, right? So when we think about diversifying our workplaces, diversifying our hospitals, diversifying whatever institution you can think of.
How about our Congress?
I was going to wait for you to say that. Exactly, right? Because think about you being there, a law professor with your background in bankruptcy, your ability to question people. You being in Congress has made differences in people's lives. If you weren't there, these things wouldn't happen. And I think that's what the intersectional lens means. If we have a group of people who are different from each other working towards a common goal, that is one way to ensure that we don't leave someone out. And that's what's so important about intersectionality. It's understanding all aspects of our identities and how we might be impacted differently by the laws and policies that we create, even when we intend to do something good. So it's a way of avoiding our unintended consequences.
Well, as you probably have guessed, if you've been watching this, I could talk to Song all night long about this topic. I wanted to close Song by asking, and like a lot of people have been asking this question, but I wanted to ask, my children and I have been talking a lot about policing. We've been talking about George Floyd and what his death meant. My My oldest two have seen the video,
Wow.
which is upsetting, but they watched it. They're old enough to Google and to find things like that. We watched the 13th, the documentary together, which I thought did a terrific job of explaining how the legacy of slavery quickly turned into a legacy of Black incarceration. And really unpacking kind of that going and then taking us all the way through the present day. What are other books or movies, particularly if you have any that maybe aren't as well known, that you would recommend that we watch? Next up on my list is I want to watch the John Lewis documentary, Good Trouble.
Oh, that's so great. I was going to say James Baldwin, right? To bring something in from the past, which is still so relevant today, or a more relevant example, not even a book, for people who have not read all of the articles on the 1619 Project. Like if there's just one place you want to go to educate yourself about the legacy of slavery, the importance of reparations, the difference between structural versus individual racism, that's where I would go. The 1619 Project, in addition to Ta-Nehisi Coates's book, Between the World and Me.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Song. It's really great to have you with us. Thank you, everyone. And I hope that this conversation and watching us be in conversation with each other encourages you to have these kinds of conversations with your friends and your families. I think parts of what's holding us back structurally is fear about having these conversations, is fear about an uncomfortableness with tackling these topics. But they're not going to get better until we're honest. We have racism in our society. It permeates virtually every institution and every aspect of American life. And if we're going to do something about it, we have to start talking about it with each other, and we have to make space for each of us to be an ally in the fight. So thank you so much for joining us, Song. It's really a pleasure.
Such a pleasure. Thank you for having me. Keep up the great, fantastic work you're doing.